Today I would like to discuss the topic whether all art is political and whether you should strive for including your opinion or your political opinion in your writing. I wouldn't describe myself as political or being attached to a specific political belief, and this should probably hint you towards my opinion on whether you should actively include your political opinion in your writing. But maybe it's a question that you've asked yourself, and maybe you have seen George Orwell's opinion on the subject, which is that somehow all art is to some degree political, and even the art that tries to ignore politics is in itself political. Excuse me if I'm butchering George Orwell's opinion here. I didn't read the essay, nor did I read the full book on the subject. I've only glanced at his definition, and I think, according to him, the political that is, in his opinion, included in all writing, or the political stance that is communicated within writing, means changing someone's beliefs on a certain subject. This is not directly related to any kind of political belief or party politics or political agenda. It's a very broad definition, I have to say. At first glance, you would probably think more about certain political subjects. I think you can find a lot of examples here, depending on the country you're from, depending on your specific political belief. I think you can find several examples that writers could include in their fiction. So let's first move away from the definition of George Orwell, which is more broad, and go to the more specific stuff. I think if you think about politics in a specific way, or if you think about a specific political opinion, then I think it's not realistic to say that every art is political. Because, and I discussed that in a previous video, there's certain historical context to stories. So there is the topic of historicism that you need to take into account when analyzing art. And there are examples of artworks, for example, like Homer's Iliad, on which people have an opinion nowadays, and people had an opinion in, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago. What I'm trying to say is that if there was a political opinion expressed in this work of art, then the perspective has changed since the story was published. And basically, what I'm trying to say, or what I said in yesterday's video, is that every artwork has to be analyzed from the historical context, and that the perspective on the specific artwork changes over time. So if we are saying that all art is political, then it might be possible that even if it is always political, that this political belief might change. And I think if you usually would think about the topic of whether all art is political, I think you would more go into the direction of, can this be assigned to a specific party or a specific political side, so to say? And I think that assigning these to specific parties, let's say, I think that this is not possible, that this is something that could potentially change. Let's go back to George Orwell's definition, which was that all art pushes the world in a certain direction, even the non-political art. And I think in that case, it's fair to say that all art is political. But I'm not sure whether political is really the correct word to choose here. In my opinion, of course, art evokes certain feelings in the viewer, like whether it be visual art or whether it be a novel. It raises certain associations within the viewer, but is that really political? I think it would be a shame that if you could say that this experience we have can be reduced to only political belief. Because even if you were the only human alive and wouldn't have the possibility to build a society, to build politics, even if you were alone on this planet, you could look at an artwork and it would evoke certain feelings within you. Now, you could still say that, well, you are alone on the planet and you remember certain political beliefs that were holding together your country you were living in before, but after a while, living on this earth alone, you would probably forget. But still, if you would look at an artwork, it would evoke certain feelings within you. Now, in George Orwell's definition, where I think that he's using the term political not fully correctly or in a very different way to how we would understand politics, I think it's, of course, right. So the person living alone or the last human alive, if they would look at an artwork, of course, it would change their perspective. It would have an influence on their perspective. In that sense, you could say, well, it's always political. But this change of perspective, this revelation that comes from looking at an artwork, that doesn't mean that the person looking at the artwork would now follow a specific political agenda. It's more that the artwork raises certain questions, makes the reader or the viewer change to some degree, and from then on, he is somehow influenced by that artwork. So in that degree, I think George Orwell might be right, that art moves in a certain direction, but there's still the value of art that is more based on perception. And this also goes back to something that I've discussed with the topic of concepts. I think even if we would lack the concept of politics, of a political party, the concept of a political agenda, even then we would still have the aesthetic experience of looking at an artwork, feeling what is expressed in that artwork. I think all of that is possible without referring to the concept of politics. The question that remains is whether you as an author should sit down and think about what political agenda are you trying to push when you think about a story. And I think we probably all agree that there are some artists that would do this. Because of course, we are humans, we have political beliefs, we have opinions, and of course, it's possible that they also are reflected in our art. Whether it be consciously, somehow they probably find a way into our art. But now, let's first look into the conscious aspect. Should we consciously decide what political agenda we are trying to address? I think the problem is, for example, my political belief, or I'm a political advocate for banning the use of raisins within bread. So I'm trying to ban raisin bread because I hate raisins. Now, if you sit down to write and you are trying to express that political belief within your writing, you can do that. But I think the problem is that by invoking that specific political opinion, you also invite the contrary. There's always, you can think of several examples. I'm not trying to give you an example. I don't want to make this into a political video, but you can think of whatever political subject you want to think about. There is always the contrary. There's always the other side of the political spectrum that has a separate idea. I think nowadays, as it's all separated into two sides, unfortunately, I think it becomes more apparent. So I think you should ask yourself, do you really want to invite the contrary of your political opinion? So if I'm trying to sit down and say, or I'm thinking about a story which really puts across my hate for raisins, for example, do I really want to invite the reader to think about the contrary? Because that's what the reader is going to think. The reader is not only going to think about the stuff you want to express, they would also think about the contrary. Don't think that the reader is not smart enough to question the story and to think beyond what's written on the page. If you think that the reader who's reading your work is limiting his creativity to each word on the page, then you are wrong. The reader will soak in the words and associate certain things with those words. You put down your story with your political belief, but the result happens within the brain of the reader. That's basically the first reason that I want to give you to think about whether you should include this in your writing. Also, what I think is that you should never, and I'm not sure whether you think that or not, but you should never give similar to what I'm doing right now, you should never in your story explain something theoretically, why it makes theoretical sense that you ban raisin bread, for example. You should tell it in a story. If you see people pushing a specific political belief within their artwork, I think what you're noticing is that they become distracted by the theoretical aspect and forget about the storytelling. The thing that actually led them to this political belief, because it's not, I think it's not the theoretical explanation of a political belief that convinces us. It's our experience of, our collection of experiences that moves us in a specific political direction. Everyone has different experiences. Everyone has a different upbringing. And so we differ in our political beliefs. But it's not like somebody at some point shows up with a flip chart and explains to you step by step why this political opinion makes sense, and therefore you accept it. It's experience. And so as an author who's trying to be political, you should never think about the concept of the specific political belief. You should try and explain the experience that led to it. And I think if you start off with that political belief, you risk that what you're doing is not storytelling, what you're doing is not describing experiences. It's more, I have this political agenda and I tell you why it makes sense. Why you should ban raisins, for example. It makes some sense. I mean, the definition that George Orwell brought up, which is not really the definition we use for politics that's part of art. I think that pushing humans into a specific direction, I think that's still to some degree correct. If we are expressing our viewpoint on the world to the audience, there's always the subconscious bias somehow that goes into the story. But that's totally fine. That's actually what we want, because we don't want to remove our subjectivity from the story. We are not trying to be an outside observer of humanity. We want to actually tap into the stuff that makes us humans, the part of us that makes us into humans, the part that allows us to communicate with the audience. This is actually what we are trying to tap into. So you need your subjectivity. Don't try to erase it. So on the one hand, you have the problem of you might be trying to be an outside observer, but on the other hand, you have the problem of being too abstract, trying to explain specific concepts. You have to describe human experience. You're trying to raise certain questions within the mind of the reader. This is what you're actually doing. And don't be confused by either trying to be an outside observer of a specific world, removing your subjectivity, or be confused by concepts that take away every kind of subjectivity, every kind of humanity, because it comes down to human experience. It comes down to the now, to the moment you are experiencing something. It's not like you are, for example, the term lawful or righteous. You are not trying to use those words. You are trying to explain righteous behavior. What are examples of that? So as soon as you see yourself moving into this abstract level, I think you are misguided as a fiction author. You should move into the more into the level of experience. Try to forget all the smart words, basically. It's not that you can't be smart within fiction writing. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm of the opinion that you should be able to dissect all of these generic overarching terms like righteousness or lawful or love or politics. You should be able to go into the specific. You shouldn't hide behind the abstraction. You should go down to the detail, to the human experience. What is the experience that led a specific person, a specific character to that specific political belief? And to conclude, I think, yes, art is probably political in the sense that George Orwell meant, but it's not always political in a party politics sense. It's more focused on experience. So you can't remove experience from the equation. In terms of the critique of a specific artwork, people from the outside can come in and classify your writing as supporting a specific political belief. That's possible. But if you are a writer, you should make that a priority. Maybe someone, well, maybe your audience realizes that, well, even if it was not your subjective goal to write a political story, they realize that this is probably your political opinion. That's totally fine. What I'm trying to say is it shouldn't be your priority. And I think you can create art without being political. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. I would invite you to subscribe, like, comment down below. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you very much.